Little over a month ago, you might remember the Russian army was massing on the borders of the Ukraine. And I thought to myself, what an excellent time to do a cutting-edge, current events type video on what might happen if a conflict there evolved. Then my wife went into labor 2 weeks early, and consequently I've been a little bit busy to get to that kind of a video. Since then, incidentally, while suffering from sleep deprivation, I've had an opportunity to somewhat rethink and redo my approach to the video, as obviously it's not as cutting edge anymore and not that useful to you for me to explain what might happen in the event of a war between Ukraine and Russia. So in an attempt to create something unique and interesting among the absolute torrent of Ukraine hot take videos, it occurred to me that there's a basic problem with the way that this war, and in fact pretty much every war, is analyzed in media, on the internet, in your bog standard YouTube video. In terms of my own background, I'm a senior officer in the Army Reserve in Canada. Now, the term senior officer probably doesn't mean what you're thinking. I'm not a general or anything like that. However, what it does mean is that I have graduated from staff college, which is a little bit hard to explain. The closest I could say is that it's somewhat like the military's version of an MBA, but I realized you'll probably get a better idea exactly what's involved with staff college by the end of this video, as I'm largely going to be explaining how I'm looking at the Ukraine conflict differently, having had that educational background. The main thing I think that my experience from staff college has done is that it's made me pretty much disregard 90% of what I see on media and on the internet when it comes to coverage of war. Here's the basic problem. About half the videos deal with what you might call the tactical level of war. This goes everything from the individual level where, is it good to have this sidearm? What do you think of this sighting system? What kind of tank is better? That sort of thing, up to, small unit tactics, up to dealing with companies and battalions, exact emplacements. Really, this is something that most people who are veterans have decent experience to talk about. This kind of video has a lot of garbage hot takes, though, that comes from people who take video games really too seriously. Or, just some people who are complete idiots. The second type of video looks at what's called the strategic level of war. These are questions like, should Hitler have invaded the Soviet Union? Or, did Germany lose the Battle of Britain before it even started due to the disparities in fighter production? Imagine someone gesticulating at a map, making broad, sweeping statements about push left, push right, that sort of thing. In terms of Ukraine videos, I've seen a couple of these that are quite good looking at things like pipelines. But again, a large percentage of these kind of videos are frankly garbage. What's missing from both of these types of videos is an understanding of the operational level of war. The operational level of war is how you turn a series of strategic goals, like conquer France, into accomplishable, viable tactical tasks, like seizing a hill. Anyone who has a good staff college education will tell you that 90% of winning or losing wars happens at the operational level. It's also the area that's the least discussed by more popular histories of war. Typically, the closest you get to an understanding of this dynamic is the phrase, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. This kind of gets to the point and kind of misses it. So before I can really explain to you the dynamics that I see in the Ukraine conflict, I have to explain how you look at the operational level of war with regards to invading a country. If you want to invade a country, you have two options. You can destroy your opponent's military and ability to make war, or you can maneuver to capture key areas that make it impossible for the warfare to continue. If the approach you take is to destroy your enemy, then you need artillery. I think the biggest gap between warfare as it actually exists and it's commonly understood probably comes from artillery. What I'm showing here is, as best as I can tell, the only time in the entire Band of Brothers series where you see American artillery or mortars impacting on the enemy. Think about that for a second. How often within Hollywood movies or TV do you actually see artillery fire? How big of an effect do you think artillery fire has on the battlefield compared to other weapon systems? Now, coming up with statistics from post-combat reports is actually quite difficult. I'd say generally speaking, you have to take any statistical data analysis and fudge it by about, 10, 15% plus or minus. There's a very high error ratio. However, when it comes to artillery, the numbers are so overwhelming that it doesn't matter. It's difficult to find a reputable statistical analysis that attributes less than 60% of all battlefield casualties to artillery. Generally speaking, the studies fall between 60% and 80%, depending on the war and the methodology. Now again, think about that for a while. That means every other weapon system, rifles, machine guns, grenades, tanks, the entire Air Force, anti-tank rockets, knives, every single other weapon system is sharing 20 to 40% of all casualties. I should point out as well that this dominance of artillery in terms of casualties isn't because artillery is a very prevalent or large arm within a modern army. For example, this is a breakdown of the personnel within something called 4 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, which is an imaginary organization used for staff courses and planning. As you can see, the artillery only makes up about 9% of the personnel within that organization, which is about 8,700 soldiers. Now, there's also about 90 soldiers that are in mortar platoons within the infantry units, but that still only gets you up to about the 10% range. Now, for those 10% of personnel, you get 1,855mm artillery pieces and 24 81mm mortars. In comparison, here's some of the other equipment that same organization has. 78 main battle tanks, 48 tow-under armor tank destroyers, 500 cannon-armed infantry fighting vehicles, 2,000 machine guns, 200 designated marksman rifles, 50 sniper rifles, 450 anti-tank rocket launchers, 7,000 rifles, and 8 medium helicopters that are capable of mounting machine guns and rocket pods. Now, for this organization, with all of that equipment, they still expect that 70% of casualties will be inflicted by the 1,855mm artillery pieces and the 24 81mm mortars. Now, how is it that artillery manages to be so dominant in terms of casualties? Well, there's 2 factors to consider. The first one is that the artillery is about the only arm which manages to fire its weapons at the enemy while not being under fire itself. Being fired at by the enemy, or the serious potential of being fired at by the enemy, decreases people's efficiency by something like 2/3 to 3/4, which is somewhat easy to understand. This is particularly why a lot of experience people have from rifle ranges, for instance, doesn't carry over very much to actual combat. It's also why you see that, for instance, statistics that comes from when police have to use their firearms shows that it's absolutely nothing even approaching the way that they would have qualified on the range. The other major factor has to do with what's called Airburst. Now, Airburst was a technology that was developed near the end of World War II, first used by the US Army during the Battle of the Bulge. It uses a small radar set to detonate the shell when it's a set height usually around 20 meters above the ground. The effect of this is to something like triple the lethality over previous shells that would detonate when they impacted on the ground. This diagram shows that the lethal diameter for a 105mm artillery shell against soft targets is 100 meters. Now, when these guns would fire, they typically do so in a battery of 6 guns that fire in a star pattern. This creates a lethal diameter of 300 meters. For context, the 105mm is the smallest caliber of artillery piece used by modern armies. The 155mm gun has a kill diameter closer to about 150 meters. Up at the divisional and the corps level, they have even larger guns of 203mm and larger. Divisional and corps artillery also includes multiple launch rocket systems. They're capable of firing up to 70 kilometers into the enemy's rear area and blanketing a grid square with shrapnel effects. In other words, you can select a 1 square kilometer area in the map where it's highly likely that any enemy not in an armored vehicle or dug in deep will be killed. For reference, this is what an MLRS impact looks like. Artillery can also fire very quickly. This is a video of a 155mm gun being fired by Canadians in Afghanistan. Now, the shells that you see on the pallets there each weigh almost 100 pounds. At a normal rate of fire, it would take that gun only 25 minutes to fire all of the shells that you see in this video clip. If the gun goes over to rapid fire mode, it would take less than 8 minutes for them to fire all of the shells on the pallets. With that as background information, I hope it starts to make sense why 4CMBG can allocate about 65% of its personnel to non-artillery fighting soldiers, 25% to more logistical, usually called the tail, and only 10% to artillery, and yet expect that about 70% of casualties will be inflicted by that 10%. Now, you might find the destruction through artillery method of invading a country not palatable. Maybe you can't handle the logistical requirements of that many heavy shells. Maybe you're balking at the casualties. Maybe you're worried there's going to be too much destruction to the territory you want to conquer. And frankly, that is a good point, as what we've really identified so far is the reason that the opening stages of World War I was so bloody. Modern artillery plus densely concentrated troops in the open is a recipe for a bloodbath. So how do you win a modern war without artillery turning it into an attritional slog? You have to do 3 things. Spread out, dig in, and move. Or as we would say within military parlance, disperse, entrench, and maneuver. But it's late and this is running long, so that will have to be a story for next week.